All right, this is a series of short talks in which I will outline some of the key topics dealing with the progressive movement. So this first one looks at the origins of progressivism. We're just going to talk about a couple of the big picture items here. So we want to start back with the populist movement. The populist movement really committed political suicide when they backed William Jennings Bryan, a Democrat, for the presidential nominee in the election of 1896. However, it is important to note that their revolt, or the movement, was not without results, because a lot of their ideas were picked up by the most successful political reform movement in all of U.S. history. This movement was known as Progressivism, or the Progressive Era. And these reformers were so successful as to totally take over American politics in the early part of the 20th century. Um, they were so successful that most modern Americans have never heard of them. They so altered the American government um, as become unnoticed. The revolution was so profound as to create what all of us would accept as normal. That's a true measure of success when your changes after a period of time are just considered to be normal. So we want to turn our attention to the domestic issues and to the desire to purify American politics at the turn of the century. Progressives, in their attempt to do this, really stood for three main principles they would discuss, and an unstated fourth principle that was key to the revolution. The three goals that they talked about openly included: number one, American government must be rid of corruption; number two, government must be controlled by the many rather than the few in order to be purified; number three, government must control more of American life in order to maintain that purity. The landmark book that identified these principles was, originally enough, the Progressive Movement. It was written by Benjamin Mark DeWitt in 1915. By then, in 1915, DeWitt was more reflecting on the success of the movement that had spread across America. Another good book would be A Fierce Discontent, and that talks about the causes and the accomplishments and the struggles of the progressive movement as well, and that's a good read to pick up. So anyway, progressives said that if the people of America were ignored by politicians, then the people would rise and make new politicians that would listen. And before we look at the fourth unstated principle, a brief comparison is in order between the progressives and the populists. A clear contrast existed between the populists and the progressives. Progressive reformers were from the middle class, as opposed to the lower class farmers that made up the populists. Progressives were therefore more educated and more articulate. Having seen reform ideas raised, progressives were even more eager than the populists to see them become realities. Perhaps a key difference here was that the progressives came from both the Republicans and the Democrats and created a more even bastion of Protestant patriotism. Farmers and the sociable gospel urban reformers also joined this cause. Progressivism even had some Southern report. In fact, if you read The Strange Career of Jim Crow in some of our activities, in the South, ironically enough, you saw a lot of progressive reform and a lot of progressive success and accomplishments. But the big blemish on that was obviously the treatment of African Americans, and the disenfranchisement and the oppression of African Americans during the same time period. So that really puts a pretty bad bruise or blemish on the Southern progressive movement. Um, Among the most stunning accomplishments of the progressive reform movement was the establishment of loose construction as the predominant interpretation of the U.S. Constitution for pretty much the bulk of the 20th century. Therefore, progressives in a sense can be classified as a return to federalism, although Alexander Hamilton probably didn't see the federal government as an agency to protect the welfare of individual citizens. Progressives linked Federal's views to the nationalism generated by the Spanish-American War, and Hamilton's views on establishing a strong central government have largely prevailed ever since. And a large part of that is also thanks to FDR and the New Deal, but that's to come. Herein lay the unstated fourth principle of progressivism, that big government should solve problems that individuals, quote unquote, cannot solve for themselves. So the spread of progressivism can be likened to like a dropping of a stone in a pond. So you just think about that ripple effect. The principles of progressivism first took root at the city level and then spread to the state and national levels, which will be talked about or mentioned in some other talks and videos. There was even, in fact, an American president who tried to spread progressivism to the international level in the wake of World War I. This would be Woodrow Wilson and his idea of the League of Nations. We're going to study each level of the progressive reform movement spread, and you should probably be able to, or you should, if not already, acquaint yourselves with individuals associated at each level. So we're going to start off first with the American city. This is the American city represented the first target for progressive reform. Wealthy businessmen who used to delight in living at city centers were now convinced by their wives as the industrial age took hold to move away from these factories. Not only did the factories belch smoke, but the workers belched too. And as more and more immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe, that cloud of air stank of garlic. These are the new immigrants that in the 1920s you're going to start seeing the quota systems being, they're going to target these immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. We've already seen immigrants from China, and then with Roosevelt and the Gentleman's Agreement, also target Japan as well in the early part of the 20th century. So the end results of all of this were there an abandonment of wealthy neighborhoods, and we see the creation of suburbs, especially as transportation, such as the trolley, improved and made people a little bit more mobile, and they were able to live outside the city and transport or commute in and out of the city to work. I think a really good book would be Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City, talking about the 1893 Chicago World Fair and the serial killer that lived in there. Eric Larson was able to paint a really good picture of how dirty this city in the late 19th, early 20th century was. So when wealthy citizens moved away from the cities, less attention was paid to crime and to repair and infrastructure and the slums that we come to associate with the 19th century, early 20th century cities were born. And it's in this context here that in 1889, a woman named Jane Addams bought a millionaire's abandoned mansion in the 19th ward of Chicago and became the mother of social work. Mr. Hull's neighborhood had become a slum, and the Hull House was established to begin relief efforts to poor immigrants. The Hull House was the first of this settlement house movement that we've talked about and mentioned with the new woman in politics. Adams blamed party bosses for the plight of the inner city and said her neighbors had to pay too much for a streetcar to take them to work across filthy, poorly lit, crime-infested streets. Their taxes were too high and their standard of living was too low. Why? Why did the residents of these cities and these slums face such desolate conditions? Because government and big business were conspiring in the Gilded Age of corruption. Bosses received kickbacks for doing quote-unquote good for communities, which turned out to be good for monopolies. And the progressives were this new pietistic expression in American politics and demanded that government be more democratic and more moral. You feel like if you increase the level of democracy, you can increase or you can better the social welfare of the citizens of the country, of the city and the state and of the country. You see city mayors take the first steps towards progressive reform. For instance, Hazen Pingree was a Republican mayor of Detroit from 1889 to 1896. Pingree promised schools and parks to win support and targeted the monopolies of streetcar utility companies, forcing them to provide fairer rates. We mentioned during the Panic of 1893, Coxey's Army. And Pingree took up Jacob Coxey's idea and provided work relief programs for the jobless citizens of Detroit. And even if three men were given one broom to sweep the streets, those three men had jobs. And that made it easier for them to accept help from the government. Really remember this, because when we talk about the Civil Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration, the New Deal, you should be able to see some similarities there. Some make work program. Note that the next progressive mayor on which focus was a Democrat, proving the strength of progressivism's bipartisan appeal. Tom Johnson was a mayor of Cleveland from 1901 to 1909 and was converted to progressivism by Henry George's book, Social Problems. Johnson fought the Mark Hanna political machine that ran the Republican Party for Ohio. Mark Hanna was the one that was responsible for allowing William McKinley to run his front porch campaign. Mark Hanna was the one that raised $16 million in this 1896 election, compared to William Jennings Bryan's $1 million to win the Republicans, to win the White House for the Republican Party. But Johnson focused on winning victories in his own city. He campaigned on the slogan of a fair affair, all right, and reformed the transit system to bring the streetcar fare down to 3 cents. He even took on the police force and broke their system of graft based on kickbacks from prostitution, getting rid of quote-unquote kept prostitutes and the men who exploited them. Johnson gave Cleveland free public bathrooms, recreational facilities, and sanitary inspections. He wanted city-owned utilities, but he ended up settling for breaking the monopolies that utilities had formed within Cleveland. Tom Johnson and other progressives wanted kinder and a more efficient government. Some progressive tools to accomplish these goals were revolutionary ideas for municipal government. Progressives developed the idea of a city manager, which was a hired, not elected civil servant who would not have to award graft to be reelected and could run the city like a business, looking after the bottom line for the taxpayers. If he messed up, the city manager, if he messed up or fell in corruption, he could simply be fired. Zoning became a progressive issue to try to bring efficiency to city planning. Some other innovations to American political science began in the cities and made it all the way to the state level in some cases. These were the initiative, which allowed citizens to launch bills through legislatures without waiting for the representatives to do so. This was a referendum, which allowed citizens to vote on whether laws should be passed. This was a recall, which allowed citizens to unelect an elected official who proved to be corrupt and or incompetent. This was also the secret ballot, or the Australian ballot, where now you don't have to be, coerced to vote for a certain candidate or for a certain party. Now it's completely done in secrecy. Churches were also the driving force behind urban progressivism. This is when we talk about the social gospel. The social gospel movement was a response by churches that were losing members to create quote-unquote institutions in lower-class neighborhoods. Rescue missions provide lodging and food, and the need for diversion was supplied by reading rooms and recreational facilities. Immigrant families were offered day nurseries since both parents usually worked in the factory. The main soldiers of the reform were young college women who lived right in the slums. Their idealism bade them to leave their ivory towers in order to become useful in doing good for the immigrant poor. Hull House began a whole wave of those settlement houses, tending to the birth pangs of the new cities. Teachers, nurses, and health inspectors worked through charitable foundations to fight child labor, ignorance, and disease. Florence Kelly comes to mind, the first factory inspector of Illinois, and she's also going to be the head of the Consumers League as well. Journalists and historians label these intrepid social workers religious and intellectual heroes or heroines, whose active faith and creative intelligence formed the basis for pragmatism. Pragmatism was this anti-transcendentalism philosophy that was supported or espoused by William James. William James said that truth must come down to reform reality. John Dewey of Columbia University dispensed with truth and said America should attack the most serious conflicts by direct application of logic. It's no longer just intuition and the matter of the conscience. You have to be able to think things through in a logical way. Dewey was an education professor who created a system to organize school libraries. He also supported a new style of education that ignored absolutes and finalities. Dewey believed that truth had no place in the age of Darwin. He believed that the theory of evolution should seriously challenge the biblical account of creation, and therefore schools should not present the world in anything but relative terms. He believed children should construct their own quote-unquote truths. In the next series of videos, we'll focus back on the Hull House again, and we'll look at muckrakers before moving forward to progressivism at the state and national level.